think this is, when we talk about the different patterns of the neurodevelopmental sequence, I think I touched on it last week when we started talking about pushing down. This is one that, because we don't see it, we don't appreciate the value of it. Once you start to see something, we've moved past pushing down. But we can't move into the world of weight shifts. We can't move into the world of perturbations. We can't move into the world of dissociation without the reaction forces from the ground. So the only way we get those to generate movement is by putting force down into the ground. Obviously, when we walk, when we move, we're putting more forces into the ground than we need. What we get is that rebound effect, the ground reaction forces that propel us forward. That's us, physically mature bodies. We're trying to get from point A to point B. We've gone through the entire neurodevelopmental sequence. We have access to that. When we're first learning this, when we're trying to restore different components from a rehab standpoint, though, patients don't have this. The infant doesn't have this ability. So they have to first develop the ability to push down into the ground and learn what pushing down can create and what pushing down can result in. But without the pushing down, we can't have a conversation about weight shifts. We can't have a conversation about perturbations. Pick your favorite exercise you do for rehab. We couldn't have that conversation without the pushing down part. And that's what oftentimes becomes the problem. We want to go from a rehab standpoint and go straight into all of these fancy drills. And I'm not saying there's a problem with these drills. We want to start doing all these advanced things. And then we spend time trying to troubleshoot all of these different things. But if we don't have the ability to push down and understand the most efficient and effective way to actually put forces down into the ground, depending on the posture that we're talking about, whatever that drill above that is, it's not going to be successful. We're going to spend time trying to fix things when we have no chance at it, because we're not leveraging the ability to push down into the ground. A great example, and I just noticed this, they got new tables in here. I can see like chairs and everything, and there's no, sorry, distracted, easily distracted. Great example of this, since we have the tables, everybody go ahead, grab a table, lay on your back on the table, okay? You don't have to use a table that you write on, we have plenty of extra tables, find a table, you don't have to move stuff around. Lay on your back. What I want you to do while you're laying on your back, I want you to I want your feet to be flat on the table so your knees are bent. We're laying here right now. There's not a lot going on, right? You're just laying there. Lift both feet up off the table. Put them back down. And really with this, as soon as your feet leave the table, you don't have to go any higher because we've already gone too far. Lift them up again, just barely off the table, back down. Lift them up again, a couple more times. Good. Now, this time, when you lift your feet up off the table, pay attention to what you feel right before your heels come off the ground, okay? So lift them off, but pay attention to what happens right before that. Do that 2 or 3 times. What do you feel? What pushes down into the table? Sacrum, your lumbar spine. So in order for us to get your feet up off the ground, remember, there has to be an equal and opposite reaction. We want your feet to go up. That means something has to push down. It can't be your feet. We have to be able to push your lumbar spine down into the ground. If you can't push your lumbar spine down into the ground, your feet will not come up off the ground. It's just not going to happen. Now how many of you guys have done any kind of hamstring stretch? Active hamstring stretch, passive hamstring stretch, stuff like that, right? So go ahead, lay on your back, grab one hand behind one knee. You can even leave the other knee bent up, or your other leg bent up if you can't quite get that there. And I just want you to straighten and extend the leg that you have a hold of. You just go back and forth with this. What do you feel with this? Anything? Feel the stretch when you get that up there. A little bit. So what I want you to pay attention to, everybody let your knee bend. So we're all still. What I want you to pay attention to is this point right here. Go ahead, straighten your knee out, and tell me what you feel right before that happens. Just do it a couple times. That moment right before you start to move that knee. What do you feel? What was that? We feel the quad, we feel the stomach, the compression between the two. Pay attention to your low back. What do you feel in your low back? How many of you guys in this position feel your low back flat on the table, or you feel like your low back is in a little bit more of a lordotic curve here? So we've increased your lordotic curve with this, right? Now, go ahead, lift the other foot up off the ground. So you're going to hold one leg, barely hover the other one off the ground. Okay? So I just want you holding that right, holding your one leg, and just everybody keep your knees bent, put your feet back on the ground. So you're just holding one leg. I just want you to barely lift that opposite leg, just barely up off the ground. Come back down. I'll do that a couple times. What do you feel in your low back now? Now lift both legs off at the same time. So let go of the one leg, put both feet back down, and then lift both legs off. Which one do you feel more? When you lift both or when you lift just one? Both. What did we change positionally with that? The angle. Because when everybody grabbed that knee got pulled up, that created more of a lordotic curve. With that more increased lordotic curve, we're not able to press down into the ground as hard. So you didn't feel that as much when we were moving that single leg. So if we're doing anything where we're lifting a leg up off the ground, and there's an increase, an exaggerated lordotic curve in that lumbar spine, our ability to push down into the ground is going to be impaired and affected because of the position that we're in. So if we're trying to fix that, oftentimes what ends up happening is we spend all the time in the world trying to fix the movement, but it's the position. We're not able to effectively push down into the ground because of the position that we put things in. And we'll talk about specifically why that you're not feeling that as much here in a couple slides. You guys can sit back, go back to your seats if you'd like to. Pushing down, it allows us to develop tissue tolerance. It allows us to create tissue adaptation. Well, why is tissue tolerance important? How many of you guys have dealt with an athlete that has developed shin splints? Everybody? When do shin splints develop? At the very beginning of the season? About a month, couple months into the season? Early, middle season, or towards the end of the season? Usually, it's not right when the season starts. There's usually about a 4 to 6 week delay before we start to see shin splints really become a problem. They've been training for 4 to 6 weeks. Why are we seeing their fitness is improving? Why are we seeing shin splints? Yes, it's an adaptation. When we see shins, here's the thing, when it comes to shin splints or medial tibia, whatever you want to call it, we have, as a profession and as a healthcare industry, it's your shoes, it's the arch, it's the glute med, your hamstrings are tight, your calves are tight. We blamed all these other things. And guess what? When we address all those other things, what happens to the shin splints? They still stay there. It's a tissue tolerance response. When we look at those stress reactions, what we're seeing is an increase in bony activity. And why do we have to ask the next question? Well, why are we seeing an increase in bony activity? That's why they do bone scans, to see if they're having any kind of a stress reaction. The stress reaction that we're seeing is an increase in calcium turnover. Why do we see a localized response in bony activity? Bone is essentially one of the dumbest tissues of the body. It literally just hangs out there. And if there's too much stress, more bone. That's what it does. Not enough stress, less bone. Osteoporosis. So anytime we see more bone developing, we see an increase in that activity. It's because the bone has recognized, the body's recognized, we have an increase of stress in this area. What can we do to make this area stronger? The only thing we can do is put down more bone. So the tissue tolerance, what's happening is when we see shin splints, that's kind of hard to say apparently. When we see shin splints, the biggest consideration, it's a load adaptation problem. We have increased the volume, we've increased the training load in too short of a period of time for that tissue. And so what happens is, instead of that tissue slowly building up tolerance over time, what happens is we try to build up tolerance really quickly. Well, when we go too fast, you get an increase in bony turnover, we get shin splints. It's not an arch problem. It's not a shoe problem. It's complete. When we see shin splints, the biggest component, it's a dietary and training volume problem. The only reason to say a dietary is because oftentimes we see individuals will become a little bit more susceptible with it at certain times. And we have a certain group of individuals that typically fall into that. So when we see that, that's a great example of a poor response of tissue tolerance. The body's trying to do what it's trying to do. It's just we're programming wrong for that person. That's 100. That's 90% of programming error. Which, how do we fix that? Well, we have to go back and we have to build up appropriate tissue tolerance. The problem is, now we're trying, in that situation, now we're trying to increase tissue tolerance in an area where we have a heightened tissue reaction and pain. It makes it a very tough situation. But if we plan accordingly, those situations don't need to happen. We talked about breathing, how it develops the diaphragm. You've probably heard about the pelvic floor. So what do you guys know about the pelvic floor? You guys have been through 4 years of undergrad. Some of you through 1 year of grad school. What have you learned about the pelvic floor? Can I summarize what I'm guessing you guys have learned about the pelvic floor? You can add to it or correct me if I'm wrong. It's important. And that's about it. Is that about it? Did you guys learn anything else about the pelvic floor? It's kind of important, sits at the bottom of the pelvis. Anything else enlightening that you guys have learned about the pelvic floor? Did anybody teach you that there's 9 muscles that make up the pelvic floor? Yeah, we talked about that last semester. Before that, though? No. So there's 9 muscles that make up the pelvic floor. The pelvic floor is important. So what you've learned up to this point is correct. You also see it referred to as a pelvic diaphragm. Basically, every discussion that we've had about the actual diaphragm, you can have the exact same discussion about the pelvic diaphragm. Without the pelvic diaphragm, the abdominal diaphragm can't do its job. The two have to work together. When we talk about breathing, breathing is important because of what it does for the diaphragm. Breathing develops a diaphragm. Pushing down develops the pelvic floor. So anytime we have, and if you have a problem in one, you have a problem in the other. If you have a problem with the diaphragm, you have a problem with the pelvic floor. If you have a problem with the pelvic floor, you have a problem with the diaphragm. If you have a breathing problem, you have a pelvic floor problem. If you have a pelvic floor problem, you have a breathing problem. Unfortunately, where things have gone is when we talk about breathing, we don't necessarily consider the pelvic floor. And if you have a pelvic floor problem, we can't fix that. That's a whole specialization. You have to go see a pelvic floor therapist. The two work together. So step one in fixing the pelvic floor is addressing breathing. We do that through breathing. That's also why breathing is step number one when it comes to creating any kind of control. To take that to the next level, we have to have an appropriate pelvic floor that functions. And why we have to have that is in regards to creating control of the abdomen of the pelvis. When it comes to being able to transfer energy from the pelvis up into the trunk, or from the trunk down into the pelvis, which is every form of locomotion, every form of sport activity, those two have to work together. And we have to be able to create this cylinder of pressure so that when we create pressure between the top and the bottom, that pressure is what increases the stiffness, the rigidity of the torso to protect the lumbar spine. That rigidity is also what allows us to transfer energy across this area. Without that rigidity, we lose control of the lumbar spine, we run into issues, and we also lose the efficiency of transferring energy across the pelvis, across the abdomen. So we see a performance problem. So we have all kinds of negatives that come around when we don't have a pelvic floor that's functioning the way that we need to. We create that internal pressurization. That's that intra-abdominal pressure that we've talked about, the Valsalva maneuver. When we do a Valsalva maneuver, we're creating that intra-abdominal pressure. The diaphragm is important, but we also have to have the pelvic diaphragm and complete the rest of that cylinder in order to efficiently and effectively create abdominal pressure to help create control of that lumbar spine. And again, from a performance standpoint, we have to have that level of stiffness so that we can transfer energy across the area. If we don't, we can't transition that energy from the top down or from the bottom up. Now, when we talk about the rest of that cylinder, if the only area of weakness that we run into then becomes the anterior side. We don't have anything there that supports it. That's where the rectus abdominis, the obliques, the transverse abdominis come into play. So which then leads us into the big problem of core strength. When we talk core strength, it's all about the rectus abdominis, it's all about the obliques, and it's all about the transverse abdominis, getting all of those to fire. When that's the last component. Because first, the diaphragm has to work. Second, the pelvic diaphragm has to create the floor to pressurize that against. And then finally, that anterior wall of the abdomen has to be able to create pressurization to keep all of that in and to maintain a vertical torso when we're doing that. How do we know that that's the order? We see it in the neurodevelopmental sequence. We start with breathing. We then get pushing down. And then the last thing we run into are weight shifts where we have to control the trunk. We have to control this area so that we're not going into an increased amount of lordosis, hyperflexion, anything along those lines, because either one of those is going to decrease the ability to efficiently transition energy across the midsection. When we see something like this, we know we have some issues. And when I say we know we have some issues, when we see either that anterior pelvic tilt, and when we hear anterior pelvic tilt, we think automatically it's a tight hamstrings, shortened hip flexor problem. And we go after and address the tight hamstrings and the short hip flexors. That's wonderful. That's the symptom. That's not the problem. When you see an anterior pelvic tilt, this is a pelvic floor problem. This is a diaphragm problem. We can stretch the hamstrings and we can stretch the hamstrings. We can work on strengthening the hip flexors to try and fix that. But this isn't an anterior pelvic tilt problem. This is a trunk and a midline problem. The tight hamstrings, the tight hip flexors, all of that have developed in response to what's going on at the pelvis and the trunk, not the other way around. That's not what's causing it. So when we see an anterior pelvic tilt, when we see, and I say anterior pelvic tilt, where we actually anteriorly tilt the pelvis, flex the hips, we can even have that increased just lordotic curve. We see it sometimes referred to it as a rib flare. All of those are problems with the pelvic floor and with the diaphragm. Why is that important? Because if you try to stretch the hamstrings, you're only going to make the situation worse. If you try to strengthen or stretch the hip flexors, you're going to make the problem worse. If all you try to do is activate the rectus abdominis to pull those ribs down, you're only going to make the problem worse, because those aren't the problem. Those are the symptoms. Those are the things that we see. This is a pushing down issue. The diaphragm and the pelvic floor aren't appropriately aligned. They can't create control. And those other things that we see, the tight hamstrings, the changes in the hip flexors, the rib flare, all of those are ways that we're trying to find control or stability because we don't have it because of the position. So anytime we see those issues, it's always a pelvic floor diaphragm problem. And then what ends up happening is this becomes a very unstable situation. You're going to have low back pain. You're going to have neck pain. You're going to have all kinds of pain that develops from this that can either be local to here, or it can spread up into the shoulder and the neck, or down into the hip and into the knees. And we oftentimes try to fix those problems without going after the fact that we have a pelvic diaphragm and a diaphragm that are not able to work together. Again, we go back to what's the neurodevelopmental sequence tell us? Well, it tells us first that breathing is important, second that the head's important, and third that the pelvic floor is important. It literally goes in that order. That's how we develop movement. Diaphragm, control the head, control the bottom. Control the bottom of the cylinder. If we don't get those three right, nothing else beyond this point matters. The problem with a lot of corrective exercise plans, the problem with a lot of rehab plans, is we don't address those first three first. We do all the fancy things with all the bands and all this stuff out here. We do lots of perturbations, lots of weight shifts, but we do those on a spine that looks like this. We do that in a situation where the diaphragm and the pelvic floor can't work together because they're pointing way out here. We can't create control with that. And I'll ask this question again. How many times do we work on a stability problem that we can't fix? And I would venture to say, if you talk to most clinicians, the hardest problem to fix is a stability problem. And the reason it's hard to fix is because we don't understand it well. We're trying to fix all these perturbations. We're trying to do all this stuff out here and never address this, which takes us back to the shapes. What's the first shape that we look at in the critical shapes? Standing. In standing, what has to happen to your midline? It has to be straight, which means that diaphragm has to be stacked over the pelvic diaphragm. So we have to have this orientation. We look at it again in bottom of deadlift. Doesn't matter in setup, but in bottom of deadlift, we want a natural curve so that we have this alignment here. In the setup for back rack, in the setup for short overhead, in bottom of lunge, and in crouching Chang, we have to maintain midline. That's the one commonality in almost every shape. We have to maintain midline. And we have to maintain midline not because we want the shoulders stacked over the hips. That's not important. We want to maintain midline because if we're maintaining the shoulders stacked over the hips, the pelvic diaphragm and the diaphragm have to be stacked on top of each other. It's so important that we look at that in every single shape. You guys will learn that next year. But just understand, that's why that's important. It's pelvic diaphragm over the diaphragm, vice versa. It's so important we look at that in every shape because it doesn't matter what our shoulder's doing if we're here. We're going to run into problems. It doesn't matter what our hip and our knee are doing if we're here. We're going to run into problems. When we talk about supine, the pushing down is going to occur through either the feet, the low back, the elbows, and the back of the head. The back of the head's important. as we push down through the back of the head, what do you think that's developing? What muscles? Yeah, cervical extensors. If I'm laying on my back, and if I'm pushing the back of my head into the ground, am I getting a lot of cervical extension? No, because there's something there. I'm getting an isometric contraction. So what am I learning to control? The neck with other movements. So it goes back to what we talked about in regards to head control. The first way that we present and learn head control is we learn to control and stabilize the head and the neck before we learn to move the head and the neck. So in supine, as we're pushing down, as we push down through the back of our head into the ground, we're learning to create control. We're learning to control the head and the neck. If you watch Callan, it's okay, Callan consented to all these videos from the day he was born. So he gave me we signed an NIL so I can use his likeness. If you watch, we see the hands moving, we see the feet moving, we see all of that moving. But in order for all of those things to happen, his lumbar spine, his shoulders, his head have to be pressed down into the ground. Until that develops, until that ability to put pressure down into the lumbar spine develops, he's not going to get his feet up off the ground. It's not a strength issue. When we talk about control, remember, it's not about strength, it's about timing. Things have to turn on at the right time so that we can express and display the actual strength that we have. So we see him pushing down through the back of his head. We see him pushing down through his lumbar spine, through his elbows, into the ground. If he were trying to bridge his hips up, which you'll see babies do, they're pushing down through their feet. In prone, this isn't Callan. I don't know who this kid is. I found him on the internet. But I subscribe to this website, and it's all stuff that I have license to use. So I didn't steal some random kid off the internet. But if you watch him, hands are moving, we see his feet moving, head's up off the ground. He's really pushing his belly down into the ground. Has to push his belly into the ground to get his feet up off the ground. Pushing his head down into the ground. Push the palms and the big toes down into the ground. So now we're learning to push down in a little bit different manner. Again, we have to learn how pushing into the ground in different orientation creates different outcomes. And it's going to be different based off of which position that we're in. In quadruped, now the trunk's up off the ground. What we're pushing down into the ground through is through the palms, through the knees, and through the toes and through the feet, depending on where the hips are. So we have a smaller area that we're pushing down into the ground. So what happens to the amount of forces that are being passed through those areas? Do they increase or do they decrease? We have the same body weight, but now instead of all that body weight being pressed down through my lumbar spine, through my feet, through the back of my head as I'm moving, now I'm putting all of that weight through the palms, my knees, and my feet. What's happening to the amount of forces going through those areas? It's going to increase. Same amount of force, smaller surface area, there's going to be more pressure. So now I'm increasing the force through my hands, which means I'm increasing the force through the shoulders. I'm increasing the force through the knees and the toes, which means I'm increasing the force through the hips. Which means the trunk now has to have that ability of the pelvic floor and the diaphragm to line up with each other. And we have to do it without the spine being on the ground. Because before it was easy, when we're laying in supine and prone, it's easy for our pelvic diaphragm and our diaphragm to be aligned. The floor is doing that for us, it's putting us in that position. The only way we move to quadruped is if we can maintain this away from the ground. So that orientation has to be maintained as we move away from the ground, which is why it takes us a while to get up into quadruped. In sitting, depending on how we sit, remember, when we're sitting, the ischial tuberosities are resting down on the ground. So we're pushing down through the ischial tuberosities, through the back of the legs. Ooh, my laser pointer works in here. Through the palms of the hands. If our hands are on the ground, we're pushing down through the palms of our hands. If we're unsupported, that means we can now reach out and grab things in front of us, just like Callan's going to use the door frame here in a second to push down into. Bless you. But we can start to generate different forces through different parts of the body. Now, sitting is important because we're pushing down through the ischial tuberosities. What's suspended between the ischial tuberosities? Pelvic floor. So now we're pushing down directly into the ischial tuberosities. That pelvic floor, for the first time, is vertical. It's now suspended off the ground. It is, for the first time, learning how to be a pelvic floor with a vertically oriented trunk. Which again is also why, if we have these lordotic positions, these anterior pelvic tilt positions. Let me ask you this, pause for a second. Let me ask you this. When you've had that athlete that has an anterior pelvic tilt, they probably have a hamstring issue. When you go straight, we stretch the hamstrings, right? That's just naturally what we do. How many times have we put people down in a seated position and done different interventions? Usually what ends up happening is we lay them on their back, we do hamstring work. We'll do some stuff out of half kneeling because we try to stretch out the hip flexor. Not saying that stuff's wrong. Those are both very important things that we need to do. But if we're trying to develop a vertical trunk, the first place we develop a vertical trunk is with our ischial tuberosities sitting down on the ground and sitting. So if we're trying to fix a hyperlordotic spine or an anterior pelvic tilt, the first place that we learn to have a truly vertical trunk is out of sitting. So if we're trying to restore a vertical trunk, the best place to access a vertical trunk is sitting. That's our easiest entry point into creating a vertical trunk. So if we have anybody that has anterior pelvic tilt, increased lumbar lordosis, giant, I really kind of like this thing, giant rib flare. If we have anybody that has any of this, at some point, we need to spend quite a bit of time in sitting. Because that's the first time that trunk learns to be vertical. That's the first time the pelvic floor is learning to be a pelvic floor on a vertical trunk. So if we watch Callan here, he's actually coming out of kneeling. He's pushing down into the wall to generate some support, to generate some control. He's going back and forth, and then he moves into quadruped. In kneeling, the knees are now pushing down into the floor, the top of the foot, the soles of the feet, depending on if the foot's plantar flexed or dorsiflexed, palms of the hand, and then also the shins. We're putting pressure down through the shins. Why is putting pressure down through the tops of the feet, through the shins important? Tissue tolerance. One of the best drills that most runners are going to absolutely hate is to have them take their shoes off, sit in a short kneeling position, sit in short kneeling with their feet plantar flexed, with their hips all the way back here. Now, this has nothing to do with the tissue extensibility that it requires through the anterior quads, through the anterior thigh. What this has to do with now, we're putting pressure through the tibia, which has its reasons, has its benefits from a tissue tolerance standpoint, but it's also creating a unique dynamic in the bottom of the foot. And what you'll see is, how about this? Go ahead and take your shoes off real quick. Somebody in the room is going to experience this and not like it, and the rest of us are going to learn from that. Yeah? Short kneeling or tall kneeling? Short kneeling. Mm-hmm. Find a table and get into that same position that I was just getting into. You can let the table works. Well, you know, yeah. I was just saying, just let your leg hang off the side of the table. That's even better. So now, what are you guys feeling with this? A little bit of stretch through the quads, right? Now sit up a little bit taller so your weight's going through your ischial tuberosities into your heels. It won't.
Are you sure?
50. What are you feeling, Griffin?
My feet and basically everything in the front of my foot.
The top of your foot.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else feeling anything in their feet? Top or bottom of the feet? Top of the ankle? Okay. Anybody feeling anything else here? Shins? And we're on a padded table even, so obviously you guys don't run far enough. That's okay, that's a good thing. What you'll run into if people, the bottom of the foot will start to cramp up with this, especially if they spend time in shoes a lot, on their feet a lot, high mileage. The bottom of the foot stiffens up. Stiffness is not stability. And so when we put people here, that shortens all of those muscles in the bottom of the foot because we're plantar flexing and we're flexing the foot, shortening those up. Those muscles don't know what to do. They only know that to be stable, they have to turn on. So we're shortening everything up. Those muscles contract, and now we get like a cramping sensation in the bottom of the foot. You guys can get out of this position. So it's not uncommon for runners to have that issue or anybody that has foot issues. Somebody's in orthotics, I'll put them in this position and use this kind of as a test to see how it feels. And again, oftentimes we'll see the bottom of that foot cramp up. When we see the bottom of the foot cramp up, that's a huge indicator that the only way that that foot knows to be stable is to always be on. The muscles in the body, the intrinsic muscles of the feet. If you felt that on the top of the foot, that's just a tissue extensibility thing. It'll, just like everything, spending time there will create that. Feeling this in the shins. Again, this is going back to one of the things we talked about, shin splints. How do we increase tissue tolerance? We have to increase the load. We have to increase the pressure that we're interjecting or that we're applying to those tissues. So we can spend some time down in these kneeling positions, exposing the tibia to different stresses with that. Is it going to fix shin splints? Not at all. Is it going to be painful if somebody has shin splints to do that? Absolutely. But if you're dealing with soccer, if you're dealing with basketball, if you're dealing with track, you know that shin splints are likely in your future. If you're working with a team and you've been with that team for more than a year, you know last year who were the people that were struggling with shin splints. We know who we limped through the season last year with that. What's the first domain of athletic training? Prevention. I think prevention is the first one. One of the top five domains of athletic training is prevention. I think it's the first one. Well, if we know all this, we have this information. We know that last year these people suffered with shin splints. We're going into the second year. Same coach, same plan, everything's going to be about the same. What's likely going to happen? Same kids are going to suffer with shin splints. Hey, practice season starts in 2 months. I need you to do this fancy home exercise program of sitting and short kneeling and binging Instagram for 30 minutes a day. Doesn't have to be all at once. I want you doing that all summer. We're going to be exposing those tissues to load before they start running. Will that alone fix all of them? No, it won't. Will that help with tissue tolerance? Absolutely. And it's a low impact way to do that. We have that information, we can start to work forward with that so that we can hopefully prevent some issues from happening. Pushing down, we start getting into the final posture, vertical stance. Once again, what we're pushing down into becomes smaller and smaller. It's really just the soles of the feet and the palms of the hand. And palms of the hand during supported vertical stance. We can all stand out and put our hands on something, but what happens as soon as we start to lose our balance? We either try to catch ourselves by spreading our arms out or we grab onto something for support. So when we're first transitioning from the floor, from either quadruped, sitting, or kneeling up into vertical stance, we have to use our hands. We don't push down into the ground to stand up. We have to grab something. We have to put our hands on something. And when we do that, we're not pulling ourselves up. We're pushing our hand down in to create that pressurization, to create the reaction between the diaphragm and the pelvic diaphragm so that we can leverage all of the strength that we have. Because let's be honest, if Callan doesn't have the lower body strength to push up out of the ground, which he doesn't, is he going to have the upper body strength to pull himself up? No. It's hard for adults that work on that to have enough upper body strength to efficiently pull themselves up. How's the baby going to do that? He's never been off the ground. So we don't pull ourselves up off the ground. Even though it looks like our hands are up here, it looks like we're pulling ourselves. What we're doing is we're pushing our hand down into that object to create the pressurization between the diaphragm and the pelvic diaphragm so that we can then maximize and transfer all of that force from the upper extremity through the lower extremity and vice versa and leverage all of our strength. This becomes a total body exercise. Not an upper body pulling me up, not a lower body pushing, but everything working together and transferring energy across that pelvic floor, across the diaphragm. And again, the amount of pressure is increasing because we've now got a very small base of support. All the pushing down is happening through the bottoms of the feet, through the hands while he's pulling himself up, while he's pushing down into the, I don't even know what that is. I don't know what that is. That's our old house. While he's pushing down, so it's a very small surface area. Because of that, the forces are increasing, which again is exposing those tissues to a different level of force. It's exposing those tissues to a higher level of force as we move up in the different postures.
No.
I don't remember what this one is. So again, pushing down through the hands, coming up out of kneeling. That's actually Callan sitting in the W sit. I let him do that for a while, and then I'd yell at him and make him get out of it. But if we look here, now we only need one hand to push down. We can move. He can move in and out of that bottom of the squat, loses his balance, falls down. Now he's coming up out of kneeling. Can still just with one hand develop enough control that he's able to get up and out of that kneeling position. If we go back again, breathing works on the diaphragm. Head control works on controlling the head and the neck, the midline. And then pushing down creates the pelvic diaphragm. Those are the first three things that those first three patterns are developing. Diaphragm, head and the neck, pelvic diaphragm. We're learning to control our we're learning to protect internally our central nervous system. We're protecting the brain, we're protecting the spinal cord with those three areas. Before we move on to anything else, we have our how we develop prioritizes protecting those areas. Again, because if we fall and we hurt our wrist, we hurt our wrist. If we fall and we hurt our knee, we hurt our knee. If we fall and we hurt our spinal cord, we have significant life-changing issues that we're going to have to deal with to become a threat to survival. So the first thing that we have to do from a survival standpoint is learn to protect those areas. Protect those areas by controlling the neck. Protect those areas by creating a diaphragm and a pelvic diaphragm that can create pressurization that helps us control the spine, helps us control the neck, helps us protect the spinal cord. So because of that, pushing down marks a transition point within the patterns. Up to this point, in each posture, there's not a lot of movement that's taking place. With diaphragmatic breathing, we see the belly move. With head control, we see a little bit of head movement. With pushing down, we don't see any movement. There's not a lot of movement that's taking place. Again, because we're learning to protect those areas. After we've learned how to protect those areas, then we start to move. Movement becomes less of a threat to those areas. So pushing down becomes that transition point between the static patterns, nasal diaphragmatic breathing, head control, pushing down, where there's not a lot of movement that takes place, and the dynamic patterns, where we now start talking about things that we can see. Weight shifting, perturbation, and dissociations. And here, the importance of this. When we start looking at the vast majority of corrective exercises, The vast majority of rehab exercises that we implement to fix movement and to correct movement, the 90% are going to fall into those last 3. I'm not saying those are wrong. They're all great exercises. But what we have to do before we apply the 90% that we do, we have to make sure the first 3 are here. We have to make sure the diaphragm, the pelvic diaphragm, and the head and neck are controlled. We have to make sure we have a vertical column. If we don't have that, the exercises will not work. All right, weight shifting. Are there any questions about pushing down before we move on to weight shifting? Pushing down again, you're not going to see it happening. It's something that you're going to feel. So just like when you're laying on the ground and you lifted your feet up, you felt your low back pushing into the ground. The thing we did a week or 2 ago where you're in quadruped and you lifted your knees off the ground, you felt your abdomen tightening up. You feel the tension. After you feel the tension, then we see the movement. We have to control things before we can move. And pushing down is the final step in creating trunk and midline control. And then once we have that, we move into the fancy stuff of weight shifting, perturbation, and dissociations. Questions, anything about that?
About that short kneeling.
Uh-huh.
So, would you explain one more time about